Author Sue Monk Kidd once said, "Empathy is the most mysterious transaction that the human soul can have." Explore with us how our ability to be empathic can actually transform our own lives. Next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. Tonight, we're talking about empathy, what it is, how we can learn to be more empathic, and its impact not just on our lives, but on the lives of all the people we come into contact with. The ripple effect. We're all about the ripple effect at Speak Your Mind. The ripple effect about hope, the ripple effect about inspiration, and tonight, the ripple effect about empathy. So, if you have questions about empathy, call them in now. Locally, dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. We'll be answering your questions throughout tonight's show. Joining me is Ted Lewis, a communications consultant for the Center for Restorative Justice and Peacemaking at the University of Minnesota and co-author of the book, The Energy of Forgiveness. Now, I have a copy of his book, The Power of Forgiveness, and I was going to bring it with me to hold it up and show it. And I went to grab where I thought it was, and the only book that I had in my hand was Why Your Cat Doesn't Go Bald. So I did not bring that book with me, but I'm very glad that you're here. And I think about the story of empathy. Let's start first with defining, I guess, for our viewing audience, like, what is empathy?
Always a good place to start. I think empathy always has to have a shared dimension. The word "with" is probably the best word. You have to have you feel something with another person. One way to contrast it with sympathy is where you would have a feeling for someone. You'd feel kind of sorry for them if they lost, a loved one, and so you give them a sympathy card. But that can be done at a distance, whereas empathy is much more intimate. You feel like you're in the other person's shoes. You can relate to something they're going through, and then you feel that, and the best of empathy then would lead to some sort of action on the behalf of the other.
And in fact, in the research that I was doing for this show, they refer to that as compassionate empathy, that when it's not just the feeling with, but the feeling with leads to a course of action to relieve the person's suffering, then we usually think about empathy in relation to others' suffering. Is empathy a thing we are born with or a thing we can learn?
I think it's something we can learn. And there's more and more research, brain research. I think for a while they thought people either had it or they didn't have it. And new brain research is really showing, some are even saying it's a choice. But it's certainly something that people can grow into and be socialized, and how it's modeled for us can rub off on people. So it's definitely an attitudinal, emotional dynamic that we can grow into.
And what are, in terms of that whole notion of learning empathy, what are things that parents do that help kids develop a sense of empathy?
Well, it has to start with having some, a sense of self and self-respect and a sense of self-boundaries, because it's really hard then to be able to say, I want that same respect for someone else if you don't have it for yourself. So there's a balance there as children grow up where they have to be rooted enough in themselves, have enough trust in their relationships around them, so that when they're old enough, around the ages of 7, 8, 9, 10, to think about do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and they're starting to think about balancing, what's fair, then that's something they're going to naturally grow into.
I was reading also that when parents start shifting from that focus of be kind and share, and where those are the instructionals, that they're giving their children to focusing more on their child's achievement, that some studies have showed that the brain centers around empathy begin sort of shutting down a little bit in the kids as achievement is more emphasized. And so I thought that the take home from that was that from raising our children, this is something that we want to be intentional about throughout the child's life and time with us, not just in those early years of, no, let's share the toy.
Yeah, I think one of the things about how any teenager is socialized is there's a natural tendency to be protective, especially if you do something wrong or you do something that gets you in trouble and you're afraid of what the consequences might be or what other people are going to think of you. You build this shield of protection around you. And the more and more that any teenager builds up patterns of protectiveness, it kind of limits their capacity then to be able to really feel for how other people might be affected by their actions. One of the things that's been rewarding for me in restorative justice, which aims to bring victimized and offending parties together for dialogue, is that once they're prepared well and they have those dialogues, youth offenders in particular can, for the first time, go, wow, I had no idea my actions affected you that way. And that's a great empathy building moment for them because for the first time they're going, it's not about me anymore, it's about how I did something that affected someone else. And then that starts to build their wider sense of community and connectedness to other people.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, because I think we all have the experience of it's easy to feel empathetic towards people who we love and who we care about, and people who are similar to us, who we identify as being similar to us. And you have worked in restorative justice where you're having maybe polarized people who are able to come together in sort of this act of compassionate empathy, and talk a little bit about what that process is, because I just think that having a sense for empathy for people who are so different or people who who are challenges for us, that's a challenge to do that, or can be.
Well, it always starts with what I call a natural mistrust. If there's a harm, a major conflict, a clash, a crime, people are going to be separating with a zone of mistrust between them. And so when you build a resolution process which promises the opportunity for them to come back together and talk about it, they're going to be very guarded about that. But as you build up trust and make them feel a little more confident in a dialogue process, little by little they start to humanize the other person. And once they're actually talking with each other, the more they hear something new about the other person's experience, that new bit is what helps inform an empathetic response and maybe even an apology. So I like to think that empathy has to hear something new to really kick in a stronger way.
And so part of what you're saying too, as I'm thinking about it, is that if you are a person who I don't trust, I've written a story about you in my head. And what that experience of dialogue offers is the person to give me new information about them that is often then diametrically opposed to the story I've written about that.
Yeah, I'll give an example. For quite a few years I had a coworker, and we had like little cubicles that were pretty close to each other, and for the first couple of years of working together we did well and there were no problems. But little by little, some mistrust issues and some strains and some clashes kind of started to affect our relationship. And at some point I realized there's a lot of tension. I don't even really want to even come into that work zone anymore because I don't trust that person and it doesn't feel good to be with them. And I struggled with just communicating openly and working together. Finally, something happened where I learned a little more about that person's backstory, and some really difficult things that they had in their family of origins and their growing up years, and that shifted everything for me. It's like all of a sudden I had a little more empathy for who that person was, and it helped me make a little more sense out of why they did things and why they were protective. And because of that, it really helped to loosen me and relax me and open up my communication with that person.
And so let's talk a little bit about that concept where what you said is that here we have somebody who is irritating you. In other circumstances, it might even be a person who's causing you harm, and how understanding who they are more completely, including the fact that they are a human being who suffers, also can be helpful. And Luth, who said, is there such a thing as feeling too much empathy with the turmoil in the world today? Or not even in the turmoil of the world, it could be the turmoil of your own world.
I think it's a great question, because we get flooded with news, not only just news, but a lot of what I call bad news. There's a lot of jarring, jolting news. And I think there needs to be two things that really balance that. One is look for news sources that aren't just about the bad things that happen, but look for news sources about how things get resolved or followed up, or how people are responding, because that's really where the human element comes in. And people who might be inclined to have too much empathy and get overwhelmed and paralyzed need to have as much good news diet as they have bad news diet. And then the second thing is we can't respond to everything. And the empathetic person wants to, like when Boko Haram in Nigeria, took those young women and abducted them. I mean, I want to do something, or why can't the Green Berets do something? But we can't do everything. But one thing I've often told my wife is, it's a little saying I made up, not the all, not the nothing, but the tiny, tiny something. We need to choose some little avenue of responding to some cause, local or national or international, whatever it is, but it can be very tiny, but empathy needs to have that outlet of response.
And Roshi Joan Halifax talks about this, and you can Google her and look her up, because she talks a lot about this concept of over empathy, and that when we are compelled by our own moral principles to feel empathic and take action, it is not at the mercy of ourselves, and that we should not feel compelled that we have to sacrifice our own health and our own principles for that, and that it's okay to have some humility about what our own limitations are, and to recognize it's okay to have limitations and be human about that.
Sure.
And that's the tiny that you've been talking about, as well as, I really love what you said, is that if we're doing a daily practice of gratitude, where we're noticing that the extraordinary lies in the ordinary, we are providing that yin to the yang, right? The balance in this cosmic universe so that we're not just being overflooded by bad, but we're forcing ourselves to notice that there's a heck of a lot of beauty in this universe to be seen.
And I think people who mature in this area recognize that inside themselves they have what I call an inner victim and an inner offender. My own theory of human nature is we're all wounded and wounding people, and so we all have the capacity to have empathy towards someone who's victimized, but deep down we should have the capacity to empathize with someone who even perpetrates, because we ourselves in smaller ways are disrespecting those sometimes the people we love the most. So the more honest we are with our inner victim and our inner offender, the more we're going to naturally have empathy for people who are in those larger zones from the news we hear or the situations we hear.
I love what you said about that we all have an inner offender, because I think that is something that often is so difficult for us to acknowledge in ourselves, and it's painful to acknowledge that. But to be able to acknowledge that, not with such severe criticism that we can't tolerate our own truth, but to see that as a way of not just wanting to better ourselves, but then by being open and open-hearted in our relationships towards other people.
Yeah, there's a great tradition in the Jewish Hebrew tradition where, in the scriptures it says, never forget that you were once slaves in Egypt. Never forget that, because if you have strangers coming into your area, you need to realize that you had that same experience and you became refugees. And the more you remember that older history of being slaves and refugees and wanderers and needing help, the more you're going to be able to have the capacity to help the newcomer. And in today's world, with all the immigration controversies and debates, I think this is really important, that if we forget that we have our own history of being immigrants, or even refugees or displaced peoples, then we're going to harden ourselves to the need of people who now have that status.
That is that concept that there isn't a them, that it's a we, and we talk a lot about that on this show, where we talk about the disenfranchisement of people with mental illness, and that we preach over and over again is that we are all one. There is no them, there is no those people, and that's what you're saying with respect to this as well. That to stay open-hearted about. That whole "there but for the grace of God go I," walk a mile in my shoes, those things that are in our culture, we can bring to a personal practice as well.
It's a form of solidarity.
Here is a call from Jim from Hibbing. How has empathy in society changed in the last 40 years? And one of the things that I think about is social media, and how not always a lot of nice things happen on social media sometimes. And so what do you see about the changes in the last over the last 40, 50 years?
Yeah, it sounds like he's kind of benchmarking it from the time of the 60s, the 70s. I mean, I do think there's been a type of protectiveness that has gotten more acute in our society, that makes us more concerned about me rather than the other. Part of that is just our schedules and time, and our consumer habits have made us go more inward, and we don't have as much time for volunteerism and to reach out, or even little things like stop on the highway to help someone. I mean, 40, 50 years ago, a lot of people would see someone in trouble on the side of the highway and they'd pull over and help. And now you don't see that anymore because people are busy or they're afraid. So I think on one hand we're kind of in a regressive period about having that natural sense of empathy. On the other hand, in the last, say, 20 years, we have a heightened conscious of victimization and issues of violence worldwide and domestically, and race issues are becoming much more center stage. And so something new is happening, I think, to make us all do some collective moral inventory.
Yeah, I think the hashtag #MeToo phenomenon is is an example, is sort of the positive social media response that is bringing certainly women, but not just women, together in a way that they would not have been able to without social media. And now I know we're getting close on running out of time here, and so what would be your message of hope to our viewing audience, and just sort of the message about empathy?
Mm-hmm. I think the main thing I'd really like to say is that if we're honest about ourselves as wounding people, we're going to have more of a natural capacity to have solidarity with both people who are victimized that we hear about, as well as people who are offenders. And the thing about most offenders is that they're offending because they themselves were once victimized. Their offending comes out of their own histories of pain. So the more we realize that we're all kind of a combination of those two things, it's going to raise our capacity to feel something for the other, feel that connection.
More similar than we are different. And so how can we grow our capacity for empathy? Well, kind of the theme of this entire season, mindfulness is one way that we can do that. And one of the reasons why is that mindfulness decreases the reactivity of our own emotional state, and that creates for us some space so that we can tune into other people's emotions. I know I've been preaching mindfulness all season, and that's another reason why. Thanks so much for joining the discussion. Y'all did a great job this evening. Don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links. Join us again next week for our final show of the season, when we'll be talking with David Romano about his experience with mental illness and his message of hope. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.